My name is Dan Jeline. I'm happy to have you join us, welcome you today to the latest in the CRS Research to Practice Bites webinar series. Today, we're lucky enough to be joined by Dr. Eric Dumbaugh and Seth LaJeunesse to talk about how to get safe systems wrong and how to get them right. These folks are going to share some pitfalls, common pitfalls associated with attempting to implement and work toward a safe system, and we'll offer some thoughts to you about how we can avoid some of those pitfalls. This webinar is going to be a bit different from what we've done previously. We are going to be taking your questions and comments along the way. We are actually going to have a whole separate session next month when we're going to respond to those questions. So we're going to be entirely presenting today. Send in your questions, send in your comments as you have them. What we're going to be doing in the next month after this webinar is over is looking through those questions, compiling a really good facilitated discussion period where we can all come back and talk about these, react to them, and the group can kind of weigh in on some of the issues that you're bringing up after they've shared their material today. Let me introduce you to our panelists first. Dr. Eric Dumbaugh is a professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at Florida Atlantic University. And he also serves as Associate Director of the Collaborative Sciences Center for Road Safety. Seth LaJeunesse is a Senior Research Associate here at the UNC Highway Safety Research Center. We're lucky to have both of them with us today. If you're not familiar, CSCRS, we're trying to accelerate progress in reducing transportation injuries and fatalities using a systems approach, bringing perspectives from a variety of fields. We are one of two national centers with a designated research focus on transportation safety, and we work with a number of partners and lots of different departments to do that work. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started today. We recommend that you use the speaker view option so you can see both the slides and our panelists. Participants, you are muted, but you do have the ability, as I mentioned, to send in your comments and your questions using the Q&A pod within the Zoom webinar platform. So again, enter them today. We'll be looking through them and addressing them next month, December 14th, when we're going to be all coming back to talk through those questions and have that facilitated discussion period. You can register now. The link is there on the screen. We're going to email it to you as well. It's also accessible if you visit roadsafety.unc.edu. You can find it there. We are recording today. It's going to be posted on the website. We'll share the slides a little bit later as well. And with that, I want to turn it over to our panelists, Dr. Eric Dumbaugh and Seth LaJeunesse, to launch right into the material today.
Thanks so much, Dan. Eric, if I may, I think we'll just kind of set the tone here about why we're talking about pitfalls, right, rather than pointers. When you look across our field, you see guidance documents, manuals, how-tos, right? We have prescriptive guidance on how to create a safe system for all road users from a number of wonderful colleagues we have, right? One issue with that, prescriptions like standards, but one of the things we've noted, and that is in the literature as well, is that it can stymie creativity or really suppressing or delaying, useful experimentation to improve safety. So instead of offering more pointers, which we do have a few of them in response to each of these pitfalls, we humbly introduce these 10 proscriptions rather than prescriptions, what we would call suggestions to avoid these pitfalls on the road to a safe system. We go to the next slide, please. And here are the common ones that we're going to sort of outline today. This is just a title slide, basically, with all of them. We're going to talk through each one of them, and Eric and I will alternate kind of having a conversation about each of these and why they're problematic, and then offering some alternatives to each. You go to the next slide, please. So the first we want to address today, if we can, is doing more of the same to address traffic injury. Again, this is a pitfall we're seeing. So what we mean by this is really thinking about approaching road trauma the same way we have for decades and thinking that we'll have different results. The problem with this is that the world, as we all know, right, is constantly changing. We have local demographics are shifting, economic cycles, norms, consumer patterns, you name it, they're changing. Things like crash modification factors often do not factor these things. This is something a colleague of Robert Noland from Rutgers has identified too. All these social elements are changing, yet often our engineering or enforcement countermeasures are not. So this is a pitfall that we see in a lot of Vision Zero programming, safe systems plans, things like that. An alternative to this would be really to take a step back and understand what is driving the persistent and emerging problems. So we have persistent problems like drunk driving, impaired driving more generally, and we have emerging problems like with e-mobility users and them being injured out on our roadways. What we need is to expand our tent of people we're working with. We don't need to keep doing the same thing we've always been doing. We need to work with different people and start looking at these problems differently. So people like mode shift groups or people that are working in drug and alcohol counseling, people who are working in affordable housing, these all have an import for what happens on our roadway. Let's work with them to really identify these patterns of what's happening out there, of injury, of what's leading to injury, of the policies and the norms, the social norms that are leading and contributing to the injury. Only then can we really start disrupting these consistent patterns that we see there out there. A colleague of ours here at UNC, Kristen Hasmuller-Lick, likes to call this as, let's get started together and then get better, right? So get feedback on how we're doing more quickly and then improve upon that, iterate and improve continually to start getting, and again, inching toward that safe system we all need and deserve. So I think I can pass it over to Eric for the next pitfall.
Yeah, so and Seth's a much nicer guy than I am. I think I might be a little more caustic. Right, so let's set uninspiring and unethical safety goals in our safety plans. Like we said, anytime you see a safety goal with a denominator, you know that somebody's not being ambitious, right? The least aspirational thing is how many people can I kill per 100 million vehicle miles traveled, right? Because when you set a goal like that, you can improve it two ways, right? You can improve it by doing absolutely nothing, right? Just let 40,000, 42,000 people die every year, which is what we do, right? But it looks like you're improving if you can just get people to drive a whole lot more, right? So let's sprawl out our environments so that people have longer commutes every day, right? So they spend more times in their car, more times doing things that they don't really want to do in the first place, right? And, 42,000 will still die, but they get to drive a whole bunch more. So these are the kind of goals that you really don't want. When you're dealing with safety, in a real sense, what matters is the number of people getting injured or killed. Every one of these people is a real person. They have families, they have loved ones, and their loss is a tragedy, right? We wouldn't put up with this with any other mode, right? 40,000 people died in airline crashes this year, but we got 300 million people in the country, so that's just a small portion of the total. That's not really helpful, and it's not going to get us to improve what we're doing. The only time that denominator is helpful is when you're doing comparisons, right? So when you get down to smaller geographies, right, some of the comparisons are helpful for establishing priorities. So the one that I find useful is fatalities per capita, but it's because it's useful for understanding how much more at risk one population is than another. So work we've been doing with CRS has been looking at what is the risk that lower income and minority populations confront compared to the more affluent ones. And their likelihood of getting injured or killed is 3 times that per capita, right? And there, that's helpful because it says we've got a real issue here with this population being disproportionately at risk. But in general, if we're going to be setting goals, every one of those lives matter. I mean, the Vision Zero goal, while aspirational, is exactly what we ought to be striving for. And I guess I'll kick that over to Seth now.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, it's wonderful. Yeah, let's just continue to talk about all these deaths, right? Accept them. So I really appreciate you framing it that way and talking about the fact that we need to talk about the totality of harm. We do. And this relates to the way we talk about crashes in our news media, even within on Nextdoor and other fora. Let's talk about crashes as isolated and unpreventable accidents, right? This is a way that we commonly talk about these. It is a tragedy. It was totally unavoidable. Isn't that a shame? And then we just go about our day. In fact, in a study we had done as part of the CSCRS, we found that a third of the stories that we saw featured in the news framed crashes, including ones where someone died, as something that delays your work commute. So this is a culture that is basically organized around a callousness. Let's not care about the people that are suffering on our roadways right now. Let's talk about how you're going to be delayed by a few minutes. Can we please stop doing that, right? This is a common pitfall. We see crashes. We talk about crashes as isolated, as they're accidents, accidental. Accidents by definition are not preventable. Let's talk about these crashes as preventable. Let's talk about how there are very basic principles that we can keep people safe, right? Like separating users of different masses and speeds and space and time, right? Deciding whether or not in an area we want mobility or access, but not both. Conveying positive social norms. When we see a lot more people say, obeying speed limits or yielding to people crossing the street, let's talk about those positive norms and stop talking about the negative norms that we constantly see, right? Talk about how these principles, when put into place, again, very commonsensical principles. Most people can grasp onto these things. How these principles, when put into place, will benefit all road users, so as to avoid this sense that this otherism, this idea that it only benefits, say, pedestrians or cyclists or people riding scooters, and it disbenefits drivers. No, in fact, separated bike lanes, for instance, which are just a very common sense measure, those benefit drivers as well as cyclists. So let's elevate the dialogue if we can, which I think leads to, part of that leads to the next point we have around a pitfall. Back to you, Eric.
All right. Yeah, so this is one that we're great at. Let's design our roads completely separate from land use, right? It doesn't matter what's on either side of the road. The road has a functional purpose, right? And I love this quote. A prominent cause of highway obsolescence is the failure of the design to recognize and accommodate each of the different trip levels in the movement hierarchy, right? Our roads are designed to move traffic, and most important is arterials, which are intended to carry the largest number of vehicles for the longest distance at the highest possible speeds, right? And our system won't function if we don't design with that in mind. And we don't really have to worry about what's going on either side of it, right? We'll just, at best, we'll just do driveway closures, right? We'll just prevent them from having driveway access to our arterial system, and the problem's solved. It doesn't matter if you have a lower income housing development on one side of the road and a Walmart on the other. They're not supposed to be there. They can walk a quarter mile up the road, go to that intersection and signal and come back, right? We don't need to worry about that kind of thing. Even more so, let's not worry at all about what the future of this road's gonna be. If it's in a rural context now, it'll be a rural context forever, right? Let's convert this 2-lane to a 4-lane rural road. And it doesn't really matter that the local government's planning to put a bunch of big box stores on there, right? Let's not worry about that because we're dealing with the function of the traffic today, right? I feel like with urban areas, this is the bulk of the problem that we're confronting, right? Which is our conceptualization. It's a US problem. This isn't an international problem. This is a US problem. We have a tendency to conceptualize our streets as serving a specific traffic function and decontextualizing it, right? Not paying enough attention to what those land uses are adjacent to it. Because all that development on either side of the road is going to have a profound effect on the user mix, on the composition of traffic, on the introduction of conflicts into that thoroughfare. You cannot separate in a functional way. You cannot separate the appropriate design of a road from its context, right? Whether you want that pedestrian to cross there or not, we know that they're going to do it. right? We know that they're going to do that. And we need to do our designs to prevent the injuries and deaths that are going to occur by that. So we can use, if we're going to be constructive, we can start with what is the design context of the road today? What's the design context going to be 20 years from now? What's likely to occur? We already project that in our long-range plans. Let's take that information and figure out what is the user mix of the street now and what's it going to be 20 years from now? And how can we prevent those hazards from being created in the first place? Now, this does require, it's easy to blame the engineers for this. It requires your land use planners to also be paying attention to where they designate things. They get real cavalier about determining where the development's going to go. They don't know what to put on arterials. They know big boxes, stores like to be on there in the strip developments. So they'll zone it for that, right? Without any regard to what the long-term impact will be. And the people that make that decision are long gone by the time those things are constructed. They might construct that, propose that 10, 15 years in the future, and it happens and the people responsible for it are poof, gone, right? So what I would suggest, a common pitfall, we have to pay attention to what's going on either side of that road, and we need to make sure that our roadway is designed to accommodate what we can realistically expect to occur. I'll kick it over to Seth.
Amen, Eric. That is something, I think you're right. That is probably one of the biggest pitfalls we have with this disconnect. Related to this, those two systems, Eric, you just referenced, the transportation, the roadway network, and the land uses often are not directly involving people in the community, right? And one of the things we see as part of the sort of rhetoric around safe system, developing a safe system, a principle is shared responsibility. It's a wonderful concept, right? But what we see this as a pitfall is that we see it as equated with equal responsibility. So everybody, so this is a really interesting concept, right? If we all share responsibility, we're all equally responsible. This is the way it's framed a lot of times. Psychologist Albert Bandura often observed that when everyone feels responsible, then no one feels responsible, really, right? If we're all responsible, we all just kind of point the finger around the room. This is what we can continue to see when we see this idea of shared responsibility. So I ask, is the person that rides a bicycle to get someplace as responsible for her safety as someone driving an F-150? Or I'll even go a little bit further than that. Is the person riding a bike as responsible for their safety as the person, as somebody or a group or an entity or an agency that regulated the power and size of that F-150, right? We really need to start taking a step back and looking at this shared responsibility principle. It is shared, but it's not shared equally. And responsibility really should vary according to the power that different groups have in the system. Those who regulate vehicles, those who design roadways and our land uses have far more responsibility for our safety than those who are using the road networks. Let's get that clear. And I know this next pitfall relates to something Eric's already touched upon, but it's a specific sort of procedure within sort of land use and transportation decision making. So I'll kick it back over to you, Eric.
I just want to follow up on one of Seth's comments. I enjoy that we seem to be coming to a consensus around the F-150 as the poster child for a bad vehicle. I use the same thing, but I usually say, the problem is the F-150 with the bro lift, right? We have a lot of these down in South Florida where they're not big enough already. We're going to jack them up another 6-8 inches with the bigger tires.
Yeah.
But yeah, another great thing we do is we like to base land use and transportation decisions on forecasted traffic, right? We develop our long-range plans, we develop models, we figure out where the traffic's expected to go, we figure out which networks or which links in our transportation network are going to experience congestion, and then we have to design that. Because God forbid somebody during the peak hour should be delayed 3 or 4 minutes getting where they need to go at the busiest time of day. We've got to make sure that that doesn't happen, right? Those 3 minutes really matter a lot more than the life of the person trying to cross the street. So much of our, and I see this right here in my own county, Palm Beach County. We have a wonderful Vision Zero plan. and we have invested nothing behind it. The entire plan is focused around where's the future traffic going to be and how can we move that, right? None of the resources are dedicated to the people who most need it, because realistically, the ways those decisions are made aren't tied at all to addressing safety. And I'll get into this one at a later point, right? So safety needs to be its own thing, right? Any investment we make, anything we do needs to start with safety. And honestly, the fact that we're chasing the tail of congestion and delay doesn't even make a lot of sense, right? We add this extra capacity for the peak 15 minutes, peak half hour a day. We got extra capacity for the rest of the day. It's simply bad economics. It's bad policy. And what people do when they face congestion is the world doesn't end, right? I've modeled this. The economies don't falter. They're actually fine, right? All that happens is people move closer to where they work, or they travel at different times a day, right? It's not the end of the world. So we could make safety the priority, or we could just continue with traffic delay being our primary concern. And back to Seth.
Forecast, or what is that? Travel evaporation or traffic evaporation. It's a real thing. We just don't have a lot of case studies of it quite yet. But I really appreciate you saying that, Eric. Relatedly to all of this, right? So something terrible happens, which is a crash, especially the more injurious or fatal ones. We rely on one single agency to conduct our serious crash investigations. This relates to the first pitfall, right, of just doing more of the same. If we continue down this road, basically, we have one agency across most places that are responsible wholly for doing a full-on investigation of most of crashes. The interesting thing about this is that the law enforcement agencies, they are really interested, or they are charged with finding what happened sort of right preceding a crash, right? And finding those at-fault parties. This identification of at-fault parties also benefits, of course, the insurance companies whose premiums are going to be going up as a result of this crash, right? So the issue with this, right, is that when we focus on only those road users in the crash, we're perpetuating this narrative of safety individualism, that again, going back to the shared responsibility, or is that it's only the fault of the people involved in this crash. No one else has any sort of import in what happened here, right? Left, of course, under-examined or unexamined in total is that the road context or policies, land use environments that basically led or contributed substantially to those crashes. Some of the things we see in a lot of wealthier European countries is there is a task force assigned to investigate those more serious crashes. And, you know, one of the things they do is they look at the context of these crashes, right? They say, what's the street configuration? When did this happen? What time of day? What's the lighting around here? Also, what policies? Not only that, they don't just talk about that single crash. They talk about crashes and injuries, or crashes like these. Are there other policies? Are there sort of engineering measures we can use, right, that would prevent crashes like these? This is where we really need to be heading, to get away from this reliance, this unfair reliance, and all the burden on one single agency to investigate these serious events. Eric, I'll pass it back over to you.
Yeah, and the next two are sort of the Castor and Pollux, Gemini twins of bad planning. They go hand in hand, because when you get one, the other one's usually walking along side by side with it. Right?
Do you want to talk about both of them, Eric?
I think maybe with time, because we're gonna have to get this. So I think I will. I'll bring them both, and then we'll let you close it out for us. All right, so the first thing is, let's totally decouple project planning and program from the safety goals that we've established in our long-range plan, our Vision Zero. This is the most common thing. Even when we adopt Vision Zero, right? We have these great Vision Zero plans. We know where the crashes are. It doesn't translate into the project development process, right? We go through our long-range plan, says we need to do a project somewhere. It could be a capacity project. It could be any kind of project, right? We go through that. None of the evaluation criteria for choosing among alternatives include safety, right? We have this issue. We're gonna come up with a solution to this problem, and it's done. It's case in point, here in Palm Beach County, we like to default our signal timings for 3 minutes, right? We defaulted at that. And for the pedestrian interval, yeah, you hit the button, it doesn't cue it to come on immediately, right? You don't get any preemption for that. You got to wait for the full cycle to go through. And it's little wonder that people don't comply. Nobody's going to stand at an intersection for 3 minutes when they need to go 60 feet. So what we have to do when we're doing projects and we're choosing amongst alternatives, we need to think about what the likely safety impacts to this are going to be in its context, right? It wouldn't be that hard to estimate what the safety impacts are going to be. We know how to do that by doing safety audits, right? So if we're going to choose a project, let's do a quick audit. What's likely to occur here? Is this going to exacerbate a problem that we expect to exist or not? And when we advance a project forward, we select our locally preferred alternative. It ought to be the one that advances safety, right? That every decision we do should, any dollar we invest should have a safety improvement, or at a minimum should do no harm, right? But we largely ignore those things. And then the next one comes hand in hand because it's used to justify the first, right? We can just assert that compliance with our design manuals ultimately result in better road safety, right? We're using the most recent standards that are available, right? Surely they were based on substantive knowledge of what the safety impacts of these decisions might be. Well, actually, not really, right? You know, you dig through the history of a lot of stuff that gets in here, it's often people making the best guess they had at the time. It gets codified and we assume that it's fact. Safety doesn't automatically occur because we're compliant with a policy prescription contained in a design manual. In fact, a lot of times those design manuals can lead us astray, which is why we've seen over the last decade a proliferation of alternate manuals. ITE's done them, NACTO's done them, local governments are doing them. Some are likely better than others. Almost none of them are based on any understanding of what the safety impacts might be. It's the same thing. It's often what our best guess is. But we can look at a design and think through how it's going to be used and who's likely to be injured or killed. And that's what we need to be doing when we put projects and designs forward. And with that, I'll kick it over to Seth.
Thanks, Eric. Indeed, we cannot rely only on our design manuals and think that'll save us, nor can we assume, though, that a lot of us do. I wouldn't say all of us, but technology will save us, right? We have intelligent transportation systems that if only we can perfectly coordinate the traffic, we can eliminate all these conflicts, all these serious crashes. Now let's talk about the specter of autonomous vehicles, something Peter Norton's written about in Autonorama, that wonderful book. We have agencies with a great deal amount of power that can shape our communities today, that sincerely are waiting for autonomous vehicles to save us, to eliminate that dreaded driver or human error from the equation. And therefore, everybody will be safe from now on, right? All of these tech fixes, we know, come with foreseen and unforeseen consequences. All technology that exists today, at least socially oriented technologies, is basically put in place to address a problem brought to us by prior technologies of the past, right? So let's rethink this kind of this system of technology saving us. Again, we want to really bring the conversation back to basic principles. I'll just say that there are too many vehicles out there. We have our mode distributions are ridiculous. They're traveling at too fast of speeds in too many contexts, especially sensitive contexts where different road users are mixing, right? We really need policies, regulations. We need to work with community members, right, to manage travel speeds, to start reducing the number of vehicles on our roads, change our built environments, change social norms, the way we talk about these things, what kind of regimes of incentives we have for good and bad behavior. We really need to start thinking about this in a broader way with community. This is not going to be solved by technology. This is going to be solved by people in the community and by people making decisions on their behalf. So I think with that, I will pass it over to our colleague Dan, to wrap this up. Thank you all.
Thank you. Enjoyed hearing that, guys. We are going to, as I mentioned, come back in a month, December 14th, we got great questions that came in. I'm sure not all of you sent your questions and comments in. If you didn't, you still have a few minutes. You can hang out here and put them in. We're going to have a field in our registration form for the December 14th discussion session that will allow you to put questions, comments there so we can see them. We're going to be digesting those and weighing in on them when we come back. We're also going to have a link to the recording and the top 10 or this 10 item list that you can refer back to while you put your questions together and get you prepared for next time. But that's all for now. We'll see you again in a month. Everyone enjoy your holiday. And thanks to Eric Dumbaugh and Seth LaJeunesse for leading us through this today. Really appreciate it.